Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. Today in this video, we're going to talk about troubleshooting logic apps, specifically around an issue that I've been having, which is an HTTP issue. So I've been getting these random, shrink my pen down a bit, random 404 issues. It's been a bit of a painful one to troubleshoot. I think we've started getting to what the cause of the problem is, but I think it would be a really interesting sort of lessons learned, or certainly sharing our lessons learned about the journey we went through for troubleshooting, and also thinking about how you go about troubleshooting logic apps and thinking about the bigger picture, that sometimes it's more than just logic apps as the end outcome. So painting the picture of where we were. So we've got this logic apps solution we've been building for a while. Generally, it's going quite well. Certainly in test, it's looking good. I've started having some problems on the dev environment running the automated tests. So obviously, I've had to sort of hide a whole bunch of stuff here. But you can see over here, we've got a bunch. Sorry, I'm going to shrink my pen down a little bit more. I think that's a bit too big. So you can see we've got a bunch of automated tests that are failing in VS Code. Now, a few months ago when we last touched this app, it was generally performing pretty well. We didn't really have any noticeable issues on it, but the last sort of week we've been doing a couple of changes, and I'm just having problems getting a clean run of my automated tests. What's quite interesting though is the on the build server, it kind of runs all those tests okay, but I'm having problems kind of sort of running them on the dev box. Now, although it's a bit small down here, this is the bit to note, is we get this status called not found. Now, obviously there's a few layers of indirection going on here because we've got the test framework spinning up, calling the management API, triggering a logic app, and then it executes it and kind of gets a result and does tests against it. Now, what's happening here is we're calling the logic app because we've got the URL to call it, and we just get this not found error back. So I've got a number of like layers going on. If you imagine, we've got the test framework, we've got the logic app itself. I need to start taking layers out to really get to the heart of what the problem is. Now, I think what I might do, I might just slide a slide in here before the next one, and we'll just sort of talk about the symptoms. So sometimes I'd run it, everything's fine. Sometimes some tests fail. It's not always the same test. So different tests fail each time. I guess one point to note on the build agent, so we get the issue in dev. At this point, I'd say with the build agent, we do have some test failures. After a bit of investigation, I think those test failures are for different reasons, just specifically related to the test data. But at the beginning, it looked like we occasionally had test failures, but we weren't sure that they were the same thing or not. So we get a 404 not found. And one of the things was, it's like, obviously to make the changes, I need a clean run of my automated tests to make sure everything's good before I start deploying to other environments. That was the real blocker to get these changes through the pipeline to production. Now, the previous version of the app's running in test. So we'll say prev. looks okay. Right, so that's generally an overview of the symptoms. So the troubleshooting process we went through was, right, let's take out the automated tests and try and make sure there's not something about the test framework that's causing the problem. So what I was doing next is I was using Postman and I was making an HTTP call to my logic app. So you can see down here. So here's the URL. I've obviously hidden a bit of it and I've chopped the keys off the end. But we were sending a request and I just put a Postman assertion in here to say, let's check we get a 200 response, and that means we're good. So I can run that test and see everything's good. Now, to begin with, I was running it in Postman and it generally looked okay. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe it's a problem with the test framework. But then I started getting problems occasionally in Postman as well. So it's just really kind of intermittent, where sometimes you seem to have a problem for a period of time and then it goes away, and then it might be fine for a while and then you get the problem again. Is the general intermittentness of it. Now, when it failed in Postman, so you can see here's the example on the right, and the problem we're getting is 404 site not found, and this bit here is the error message we get back, and there's a bit more of an HTML page that we're seeing there. So that was the error that we got. Now, we did a bit of troubleshooting and it was kind of getting to the point where it sort of felt like, look, we need to raise a support call now because we think something behind the scenes might be an issue here. I think one of the other symptoms actually was if I went to the portal, I could always see the logic apps. So maybe we'll put a couple of notes back on that previous slide actually. So if I resubmit, looks okay. If I resubmit in the portal looked good. So I can see all of the logic apps. The log stream looked okay. So one of the things quite often, when I've had 404s in the past, quite often it would be one of the workflows was invalid in some way. It didn't get loaded into the function runtime. And you might see this with a function app sometimes, is the function doesn't exist. So normally with a logic app, you might not see it in the portal and you would see something in the log stream. It's quite a good little sort of area. If you're not sure what's going on, you can go in the log stream, go to the file system, and you can see what's actually loading up. And you might see there was an error loading your function, but I could see the workflows there. I also checked App Insights, and it's kind of there's nothing really in App Insights that sort of looks like it relates to this problem. The other thing was so we had probably 20 workflows in this logic app. To begin with, I thought it was specific workflows. Over time, it became apparent it was most of them. What we tended to find in our automated tests back here, so you'd notice that like down here, there's a few that passed, even though most of these up here have all failed. And I tended to find as an observation that there was a few at the bottom that seemed to quite regularly pass when I run the whole lot of them. But I don't know if that might have just been that they were at the end of the list and it kind of started working by that point. But certainly most of the ones at the top seem to fail all the time. And sometimes we'd have nearly all of them would fail. Sometimes we'd have a chunk at the bottom would fail. So again, it was very intermittent. Now, going back to Postman, so the next thing that we did at this point, I guess we raised a support call. One of the challenges around the support call was Microsoft really wanted a run ID to begin with to troubleshoot this. So obviously in this point, when we get this error here, this one on the right, we don't have a run ID, no workflows trigger, there's no runs you can see in the portal. So it's not like you can provide a run ID to troubleshoot the workflow because the workflow didn't start. we got confirmation from the support team that the workflows looked valid and there didn't seem to be anything incorrect about them. So really, we were trying to look at where do we go next and what kind of things do we do. So one of the things that I did was we created this postman test, but we ran it in a collection. So sometimes I would see what was on the left, where you can see here, I've ran it and everything's fine. And it passed 100 times. So we do 100 iterations, every single one of them would pass. And then sometimes we'd see what was on the right, where we've ran the exact same collection. It could be anything from immediately after we just run it again, or it could be 10 minutes later, a couple of hours later, whatever. And you might sometimes see like some of them passed, some of them failed. And it was usually the first 54 failed, then it started working, and the next 46 passed. We didn't really see the behaviour where they were just intermittently passing and failing. It was usually a chunk of time they failed, and then it would start working, or it would be working, and then it started failing for a period, and there'd be a whole load of them fail. So we're doing this so what I did actually, just to know, I put a ping workflow in. So obviously some of our workflows would be quite complicated, and I've just put a workflow in that would be a request, a compose, and then a response. And I thought, well, if I put that workflow in as a ping, it takes all of the complexity of the workflow out, and it's the minimum amount of things I can really have to demonstrate a workflow executing. And then if I can get the error with that, it's not something about my workflow code. However, obviously in a logic app, you've got a whole bunch of things like the host file and app settings and all that kind of thing that comes into play. That could mean your workflow app isn't working properly. But the fact that it works sometimes sort of says, look, the app can work. It's just sometimes it's not working. So that in theory should rule out a lot of the possible config issues. So one of the tables I shared with Microsoft was we repeatedly ran that collection of 100 tests, and you can see here, so I've got all the times, and this one here at 3 p.m. was about 50-50. There was a couple of ones failed for a different reason. Then we had 3:02, 3:03, 4:05, all fine. 10 past 4, about 50% of them failed-ish again. And then immediately after they all worked, and then 10 minutes later they all failed twice, and then they all worked again. And we hadn't made any changes to the logic app. We hadn't made any changes to the postman test. We just click the button, ran it, and wait and see what the results were. So it kind of shows that it's kind of intermittent and unhealthy. Okay, so what does it look like it's happening? So if we take a step back for a minute, we've got our logic app over here. We've got multiple workflows inside it. And then we've got this workflow ping that we're focusing on. And so some of these workflows out here call one of our systems via APIM. But this one here is just an echo. And then over here, so I've got VS Code hitting that workflow. I've got Postman hitting that workflow. These are on my machine. This logic app's in West US 2. I'm in Newcastle. In the UK, and we also had the build agent so the build agent's in West US 2. However, the build agent, this is dev. The build agent deploys. So, you know, I'll keep the diagram simple, but it basically gets the code from the code repo and it deploys to our build subscription. And there's a build version of this logic app, and it's running the tests against there. And I hadn't really, like, I'd done a little bit of looking at that about config settings and differences, but I hadn't focused a lot of effort on looking at that. And obviously there was going to be a bit of work to repoint the build agent, but it is interesting to note that we didn't really have no 404s. That's terrible writing, Mike. So we didn't get 404s particularly here, but we're getting lots of them over here. So a couple of things to think about at this point are definitely the fact that I'm in a different location could be a factor, so we need to keep that on our radar. Definitely the fact that the build agent's not having a problem, we need to keep that on our radar as well. These two tools both get the problem, so we know that it's unlikely to be something specific to the test framework code, so we can probably lower the priority of thinking about the test framework code. The logic app, the fact that it works sometimes suggests that it could be the logic app, but it's probably, again, less likely. So I was wondering, there's things like, well, behind the scenes, so that logic app lives on a plan. Is there multiple nodes? Now, I checked our plan. We've only got one node. So in theory, there should only be one node. It's not like behind the scenes, it could be hitting different nodes and one of them's unhealthy. That is something that may be a factor if you had multiple nodes. The one thing we don't have visibility of, because we don't manage the infrastructure, I don't know that there's not two nodes behind the scenes that we don't have visibility of, and we just see it as one in the portal, and one of them didn't get trashed or something. I guess that could be like a cloud abstraction, so we need to kind of keep that on our radar potentially. But that's really where we are at that point. So next off, what we started thinking about was, well, what about the root URL for the website? So, or for the workflow app. So previously we'd been hitting the direct URL of a specific workflow and getting these problems. However, if you notice down here, for things like an app service, web app, function app, logic app, you can hit the root URL and it would give you that page telling you it's up and running. So this is the actual app here, and you can see I get this, your function app's up and running. It's actually, you've got workflows in it, but it lives on a function app. So I can put that in the browser, I know it's good. I can also put it into Postman, and then here I get the confirmation, the same as that there, and I'm getting that HTTP status code back. So I know this is good when I put it in. However, it's an intermittent problem, so we need to check if that's happening all the time or not. So what we did was we created some tests, again, just pinging the root URL, no workflow execution, just can we hit that root domain name for the logic app. So we did. You can see, if you notice just here, obviously I've had to like redact the URL, the full URL, but you can see this time it doesn't have this bit on the end with a path for the workflow. It's just the root address, and you can see here we were actually getting the 404 on the root URL. So I would in this particular run we got 100% failures, and also if I stick it in the browser, you can see we're actually getting the same error. Here, so that sort of says to me this is more of an app service problem and less of a logic app problem. The fact that the logic app's what I'm using, but it lives within an app service, and if the app service isn't working, then the logic app's not going to work either. So that changes where we need to look slightly. Now, what I did next was I started running some of these tests again, and I would, like we did before, I could repeat the same pattern where when we get, sometimes it would run fine, sometimes it wouldn't. and it was really the same behavior whether we called the root URL or the workflow. What I was doing as well was, you can see here, I actually ran it pretty much at the same time in the browser in Postman, and this one's actually good. This one's getting the 404, so you can see it's really intermittent. I was wondering about things like, well, do I have a sticky session on the web app? I checked that setting's not turned on, but maybe I'm just hitting the same node or something behind the scenes, and it's to do with just the session I've got in the browser or something like that. But it just seems, again, so intermittent where it's just working or not working. So that showed we can be getting success and failure almost at the same time. It's not just the workflow; it's actually the app itself. And I think, thinking back right at the start, the 404 said site not found. Which was maybe a bit of a clue that it was more of a site problem. Lesson learned there didn't indicate it was a path issue or something like that. So we need to look into that a little bit more. Now, so on the URL, the root one, here's another example of sometimes it was working, sometimes it wasn't. You can see that 100 tests, it was half and half, so we were getting the same behavior. So at this point, I'm kind of thinking, right, well, I'm running these Postman tests in VS Code from my machine. What happens if I start running them from other locations? So the easiest way for me to set this up is we've got Serverless 360. Serverless 360 lives in West US 2 for our deployment. So we've got a private host and version of Serverless 360. In Serverless 360, we've got this feature called API Endpoint Test, which is basically a way I can register a URL. So you can see I've had to redact it there, but that lets me register an endpoint, and it'll ping it in the background just whenever it needs to. So here, this one's actually the workflow URL. So that workflow pings. Every time it pings it executes that dev workflow. I set that up and I basically left it overnight. And what will happen is Serverless 360 will ping it every time it runs its health checks. So I think I'd configured it to run about every 5 minutes. So it just keeps pinging that workflow. And if there was any errors, that would have triggered the alerts from Serverless 360. And then, again, I've had to take the name off there, but I would have been able to go in the app and see any incidents that had been logged. So overnight, I hadn't had any errors. So that sort of said to me, right, well, maybe this is to do with, or certainly there's a difference between if it's running on Azure versus if it's running from my house. So the next thing I was looking at was, well, can we do more extensive tests on Azure? So what I did next was I set up an App Insights availability test that you can see here, and I've basically configured this for the root URL. So one of the differences, I guess, between Serverless 360 and App Insights here is over here I could do a post with a message to that workflow. I can't do that with an availability test in App Insights. These are only gets, but what I did was I did a get on the root URL for the web app. So that would do the same test we did at the end earlier about just checking, is the app actually there? So you can see over here, that's been running for a few hours and I've just had no errors. It's green every time. I've got it pinging from all of the different locations you can see down here. So there's a whole list of them further down, and I just haven't had any errors at all. So this looks to me like if I run the code on Azure, it's good. Sorry, if I run the call from Azure, it's good. If I run it from home, it's bad, or it's intermittently bad. So sometimes it's working, sometimes it's not. So that's the real difference that I think I've identified here. Now, what I'm getting, so the first thing would be, well, is that a problem with my networking, Azure's networking, or something else? Now, the fact that I'm getting we get the 404 from Azure sort of suggests that I'm hitting Azure and then it's returning the error. So it's not really looking like it's not that I'm not able to get to Azure, because otherwise I wouldn't get the Microsoft web page giving me an error. So that to me sort of says, look, it's probably something networking related in Azure getting to my web app would be my thing. So let's jump back a second. So what does it look like that's happening? So if we think about bigger picture architecture, so we've got our logic app here. Sorry, I can't spell at all. So I've got my logic app. Inside it, I've got some workflows. Them workflows are calling other systems. Now, the logic app itself, let me just see if I can move that a little bit. There we go. Let me see if I can move. All right. So logic app lives inside function runtime. That lives inside a web app. That lives inside an app service. And that's in WestUS 2. Now, one of the things to think about is what are the entry points that I get to this web app from here. So I guess if we just draw this a bit bigger, so we'll say this is WestUS 2, and then I guess you've got the rest of the global Azure. So things like my App Insights tests running on the Edge network, on the CDN network. So it's hitting from different CDN Edge locations. It's pinging my workflow. So this traffic here is all going to be on the Azure network behind the scenes. So that's all Microsoft controlled stuff. My serverless 360 lives here. And again, that's coming through fine. Now, from home, the question's what's the route that I'm going to? So the likelihood is I'm probably hitting Azure somewhere closer to the UK, I would assume. And then from here, I'm being routed through to WestUS, through to my workflow app. And I'm thinking that for me, the error is probably somewhere here, where once I get onto Azure, somehow that routing from my entry point onto Azure is not sure how to get it to that app. That would explain why here I'm getting a 404, because it can't find site not found. Site not found. And if I couldn't get to Azure, I would get an error here, probably indicating it can't find Azure or something like that, or it probably would get some kind of other error. And if I was getting an error from here, I would expect something more logic app specific. So it feels like this is the issue. So if we think back to the support case, so the Microsoft support team have been looking here and they're escalating to the logic app team, and they're going to struggle to see anything because the app looks healthy, the traffic just isn't getting to here. So this is where actually if we trace back out, the likelihood is with the error being over here, it's going to be something networking related, something app service related. That's going to be the problem, which is a really interesting thing about how the support case would actually be handled and travel through the Microsoft Teams to get a resolution for this. Because in theory, this should just be pinging that all the time and not be an issue. So hopefully that explains what we think we need to do next, is to start probably looking at why this isn't, there's some kind of issue here. But I think take a step back for a minute, and what I want to get out of today was, by talking about our issue, what does this mean if we're building logic apps? Because it's different to what we're used to on consumption. So much stuff was hidden away from us that with consumption and ICE logic apps, that we tended to not have that kind of problem with ICE and consumption. But with logic app standard, there's some really interesting dependencies that we need to think about when we're troubleshooting. So if we just map these through, so here I've got my logic app. So the kinds of problems I can have in my logic app could firstly could be a workflow issue. So if I've got an invalid workflow, I might then, one, I'll see an error in the run history. You might see, if you've got a problem with your workflow not appearing, you might need the log stream. Or you might need App Insights to troubleshoot these problems. They would be my three first go-to tools for troubleshooting a workflow-related issue, either something in the workflow or something problem with it loading up. Right. The next thing is, right, in our logic app, we've also got things like parameter files. We've also got host.json. So problems with these can stop your logic app spinning up. So the likelihood is something like there you want, again, App Insights, or you want log stream. Would help you troubleshoot what issues you might be having in that location. The logic app then lives in the function runtime. So a lot of these same things, I mean, I guess you could argue host.json probably is really part of the function runtime. You'd be using the same tools here for troubleshooting any issues related to the function runtime itself. You've then got the web app. So you can then have problems with things like the site configuration, things like app settings. You could even have things like networking, so VNet integration, private end. Well, I guess these start crossing that boundary into networking, don't they? So private endpoint could be a problem. Let's think what else there could be. So again, probably tools like App Insights and Logstream are going to help you troubleshoot a bunch of that stuff. There's obviously the diagnostics area as well. So that area of the Azure portal will do some tests on a lot of this stuff and help you find some issues. We were looking there at one point, but we just didn't find anything particularly that was going to help us. But if we think about the other things related to our logic apps, so we've got storage, so we've got a dependency on storage. So you could have things like, well, what if my storage is not performing well enough? What if my access changes to the storage? If you change your network in here, that might limit your access to the storage account, for example. You've got questions about, well, how many storage accounts do you use? Do you use separate ones for each app and that kind of thing? So the storage dependency could have issues that could affect your logic app. The app insights dependency. So with app insights, the telemetry, it's probably less likely to be an issue that affects the running of your logic app, because the telemetry is going to be behind the scenes. But you might find, one, it's a great source of info. Two, it could be if you don't see telemetry appear, and it could indicate you've got problems over here in your config, so that the info's not appearing. It's also one of these ones you might have to think about cost. So troubleshooting cost, you might want to turn sampling on or tune what data goes into app insights. We've then got, so because we're on the app service, we've then got the plan. So if we work this way, we've got the or you might be on an ASC. So again, if you're on an ASC, you could have your VNet down here. Rather than a per app, it could be a per plan. You've got things like the scaling. What else? Let me think. Number of apps, and so you might have like a noisy neighbor app. So if your team's developing 10 apps and one of them's taking all of the resources of the plan, that could affect other apps. You could have, let's think what else. Well, certainly then the app service plan, that brings in things like the Azure networking. So it's the under the hood infrastructure on Azure to get traffic around, to make things talk to each other, to allow people coming into your apps. This is really where my problem looks like it is in that zone. But what I really wanted to talk about here is like when we think about troubleshooting these apps, we've taken on the power and configurability that Logic App Standard gives us, which lets us do lots of really cool stuff, manage how we load things in a different way, and there's lots of good things, but we also take on this extra complexity where the consumption app, Microsoft did a lot of stuff for us, and we didn't have these tuning knobs. So there was less dependencies to worry about, things like our storage or app insights, even our networking wasn't the same. So when we troubleshoot these difficult problems, we need to think about the wider, bigger picture. And my lesson learned here was I was focused a lot on, well, why is this workflow not working? And I spent quite a bit of time troubleshooting that. And then I've had thought on and took a step back and sort of just checked, look, the app itself isn't working by the same pattern, this intermittent 404. That would have pushed me in a different direction. So it wouldn't be a Logic app problem. It's really an app service problem. And I think that's is it really a Logic app problem? In my case, it was app service / networking. It's not even my network or my private endpoint. It's that is a public endpoint. It's the Azure under the hood networking coming in. But think about those dependencies. We've got all these dependencies here that could affect what you initially think is a Logic app problem. It could be one of these other things affecting you. So my takeaway would be, right, step one, is the app running? Step two, check the Logic app workflow itself. What kind of behavior and patterns are we getting? Check your log streams, check your app insights, check your diagnostics. And then those are going to be the common sources of information that will help you troubleshoot these awkward problems. I hope this video was useful to people. We wanted to go through the journey. We'll share this with the product team as well for getting some feedback on our support call. Hopefully I'll let people know what the outcome is of that. I think we've got a way forward now, because we were a bit stumped thinking, well, there's no run ID. why is the logic app not triggering? It actually looks like it's a different problem. If people like these kind of videos, please let me know in the comments, because I'm sure we can do more of this kind of content. And hopefully you'd like to subscribe to my channel and keep up to date with future videos. Thank you very much for listening.